When J.K. Rowling came out as a TERF, I realized something that apparently no other person seemed to notice at the time, at least from my perspective. As far as I know, no academic or layperson has ever said what I'm about to say. Namely, that the insistent refusal to acknowledge the existence of misandry as a systemic societal problem has significantly favored TERF rhetoric, and it has allowed it to gain a solid foothold in the mainstream discourse by poisoning the very vocabulary we use to fight against inequality. As a prime example of how this is manifested today, I would like to talk about an essay called Transmisandry is Not Real by Devon Price, an esteemed psychologist and the author of the acclaimed book Unmasking Autism, Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity, which I myself have read and highly recommend to anyone struggling with their identity as an autistic person. I say all this to emphasize that Devon Price is not an idiot. I have great respect for his work. This, however, goes to show how deeply rooted certain toxic beliefs can be, both in academia and outside of it, that even an otherwise well-respected scholar with fairly progressive views can reproduce backwards-thinking falsehoods that immediately collapse upon scrutiny. Devon Price begins his essay with a categorical statement that there is no systemic misandry, that men are not oppressed for being men. This, of course, is factually incorrect. And since he uses this as the foundation of his thesis, I am going to debunk it as quickly as I can before moving forward. Misandry, or misandry as Americans call it, is the hatred or contempt towards man or masculinity. It is the male equivalent of misogyny. For some reason, it has become fashionable to claim that misandry isn't real, as a way to trivialize or minimize the suffering of men. Of course, the people who perpetuate this belief, Devon Price included, claim that this is not their intention at all, that men's suffering is perfectly valid, it's just not misandry, and definitely not systemic misandry. They claim that their objection is semantic. I know for a fact that Devon Price understands the power and effect the linguistic aspect of oppression can have. How simply the language we use to refer to certain things can affect how we perceive those things, and how easily we can dehumanize people through language. I know Devon Price knows this because he mentions it in his book several times. When we say things like, men experience prejudice and sexism, but not misandry, and certainly not systemic misandry, we are effectively communicating that men's suffering is less important than the suffering of other people. Because other people do suffer from systemic discrimination, and therefore that should be addressed first. And once we have solved all those other systemic issues, then we can start bothering with the suffering of men, which is not systemic in any way, and therefore should be the last thing we solve. By simply making this semantic distinction of excluding men's suffering from other types of suffering, we essentially create this hierarchy of social importance when it comes to perceiving this suffering, and we can easily see how many men have internalized this when they feel the need to apologize for the space they take, even when they express their suffering. When I myself started making this video, I felt the temptation to create a disclaimer explaining how, even though I talk about the problems of men, this does not in any way negate the importance of the problems of women. I felt compelled to say this precisely because I have been conditioned to view my own problems as lesser than the problems of women. I have been taught this by society. And this is why I eventually decided to not do it. So, is misandry real? Do men face explicit or implicit hatred, contempt, and discrimination simply for being men? Yes, they do. Men are constantly body shamed for being bald or having a small penis or having so-called man boobs. They are shamed for not being brave, for not being tall enough, for not having a six-pack. They are far more likely to be treated as potential sex offenders when interacting with children, especially children that aren't their own. They are viewed as more violent and less trustworthy. Are men denied certain social positions simply for being men? Yes, they are. Men are less likely to be granted positions of caretaking, especially in the context of children. Of course, a bad faith counter-argument would be to claim that these aren't instances of misandry. They are side effects of misogyny. Society hates women so much that any feminine traits are suppressed, even when they are exhibited by men, So when a man is shamed for having a small penis, he is essentially being shamed for being like a woman. This reasoning is quite fallacious, since it doesn't seem to fit all forms of misandry. For example, how is being ridiculed for being bald misogyny? Women aren't bald. But even if it did fit, this is precisely the type of exclusionary thinking that leads to the dehumanization of men. The misgendering of any person is harmful, regardless of whether they are man, woman, cis, trans, or anything else. When a man's gender identity is being attacked, it should be regarded as an attack on manhood, not misogyny. Just like a woman may be shamed for not exhibiting enough gender signifiers of feminine performativity, so can a man be shamed for the equivalent thing. If a man is shamed for not being able to grow a full beard, that is an attack on his masculinity, not an attack on women. Just like when a woman is shamed for having thick body hair, it is an attack on her femininity, not an attack on men. It is both intellectually dishonest and immensely harmful to co-opt men's suffering as women's suffering. And now you may start to see how this affects trans men, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Any act of sexism can be reinterpreted and recontextualized to be about the opposite sex or gender. For example, the assumption that womanhood is naturally associated with nurturance victimizes both men and women. When women don't live up to the expectation of being devoted mothers, their femininity is attacked. When men don't live up to the expectation of not being devoted fathers, their masculinity is attacked. The way I see it, both interpretations are equally valid, and we use the context to decide which interpretation to go for, usually depending on whose experience we wish to focus on. But to outright claim that one of these interpretations simply doesn't exist is to completely erase the lived experiences of an entire gender. Shaming a man for exhibiting feminine traits is harmful. Shaming a woman for exhibiting masculine traits is also harmful. But we can't call both misogyny. It is simply illogical. Men have the right to have a gender identity and to defend it from attacks, and when that gender identity is attacked, it is and should be recognized as misandry, because the denial to one's identity is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, forms of hatred, discrimination, oppression, and dehumanization. It is simply absurd to call it anything else. When a man is misgendered, it is his masculinity that is being attacked. Just like when a woman is misgendered, it is her femininity that is being attacked. There is a common talking point people mindlessly parrot whenever this issue is brought up. It's the patriarchy, they exclaim. The patriarchy doesn't just hurt women, it also hurts men. This is such a low-effort cop-out. Every single time people invoke this fallacy, they use it solely to trivialize, minimize, erase, or distract from men's suffering, because it doesn't actually address anything. No man is actually helped when you say that. It doesn't stop men from committing suicide at around 4 times the rate of women. Besides, if the patriarchy hurts both men and women, then by definition we concede that the patriarchy oppresses men, so misandry is real. Of course, the bad faith argument may continue. Even if we were to assume that all this suffering of men is misandry and not misogyny, it's still not systemic misandry. The whole quote-unquote systemic gatekeeping is something I personally abhor, regardless of when it's used. It was created solely to exclude and minimize the suffering of certain people, because it's a goalpost that keeps on being shifted. I really despise debating against such a bad faith argument, because no matter how many things you mention, the goalposts are always moved further and further ahead. You can say, what about military conscription? That's an entire institution prejudiced against men, viewing them as disposable, objectified tools to be used by the government and discarded for the good of society. And of course, the previous bad faith argument may return and repeat the previous point again. Well, that's because of the patriarchy, so it's not misandry, it's actually more misogyny. The reason the military doesn't conscript women is because they think women are weak and fragile. Therefore, military conscription is not prejudice against men, it's prejudice against women. So, according to this argument, the fact that millions and millions of men are sent to war, where they have their limbs blown off, where they bleed to death, in the middle of nowhere, scared and alone, were the lucky ones who managed to survive through all that trauma, return to civilian life with crippling PTSD for the rest of their lives. All of that is actually about how women are oppressed. Do you see how infuriatingly insulting it becomes when we insistently frame every act of sexism under this lens of radical feminist theory? When a boy is raped by an adult woman and receives literally zero empathy, while his own rapist, who pleads guilty to the crime, doesn't even go to prison because the judge thinks women can't be pedophiles, it is not only illogical, but also immoral to deny the reality of misandry. Only ideological indoctrination would cause someone to look at a case like this, turn around and say, well, the reason this woman was given only a few hours of community service for having sex with a minor is another instance of how the patriarchy oppresses women by seeing them as incapable of being dangerous. It is academic word salad used for the sole purpose of distancing ourselves from the brutal reality of the normalization and trivialization of male rape. Imagine looking at that boy and saying to him, sorry, even though your suffering is valid, you are not really oppressed, even though you couldn't find justice in a court of law, even though mental health care professionals dismiss you. It is your rapist who is oppressed, not you, and that's why she didn't go to prison. Devon Price states that there is simply no social structure under the sun in which men hold less power than women, which again is factually incorrect. For example, in the judicial system, which is both a social structure and a governmental institution, it is well known that, controlling for the type of crime, men on average receive far longer sentences than women do, and women are twice as likely to avoid incarceration when convicted. So in the judicial system, men as defendants hold much less power than women as defendants. So I think I have provided enough evidence to thoroughly debunk the claim that misandry, both the systemic and the regular kind, isn't real. After all, when someone makes such an absolutist claim, the only thing required to destroy it is one example to the contrary, and I have provided multiple. I could go on by mentioning how most homeless people are men because there aren't enough men's shelters, how made to penetrate is not classified as rape in most legislations, how over 90% of incarcerated people are men, how male prison rape is treated not only as a joke but also as part of a convict's judicial punishment. But I don't want to waste too much time on debunking something so demonstrably false as the notion that misandry isn't real. Even if we didn't have mountains of evidence disproving such a ridiculous claim, the very notion that one social group somehow has the ability to be immune to all forms of persecution is illogical to the point of absurdity. You can hate women, gay people, lesbians, autistics, dyslexics, deaf people, blind people, short people, tall people, bald people, fat people, thin people. You can hate all these people for who they are, but for some strange and magical reason, men are impervious to being the victims of hatred. Somehow, nobody hates men for being men. People can hate everyone for being what they are, but nobody hates men for being men. It is such an outrageously illogical and fantastical claim, yet somehow it is often taken for granted, even though it is utterly nonsensical. In fact, one could easily argue that the very claim that misandry doesn't exist is in itself an expression of misandry, as it erases the lived experiences of billions of people. The language used is also eerily similar to the one used by bigots when they try to normalize their bigotry. Racists often say things like, I'm not racist, I'm just acknowledging the fact that black people are naturally more prone to being violent because they have higher testosterone levels. Transphobes will say things like, I don't hate trans people, I'm just acknowledging that chromosomes exist. In the case of misandry, the argument becomes, I don't hate men, I just discriminate against men. I exclude men, I am prejudiced against men, I abuse men, but I don't hate men. It's blatant denial of reality. So misandry is real. Men are actually being oppressed for being men, in a number of different ways. Now that we have established that, we can move on. Devon Price mentions how, after transitioning, he saw positive differences in how people perceive him or his work, and cites that as evidence for masculine privilege. No disagreement here. there are plenty of advantages society grants towards men, and being taken more seriously is one of them. The problem is that Devon Price seems to be willfully blind to all the disadvantages men face. And even when he does acknowledge them, he uses mental gymnastics to attribute them to something else, so he won't have to call it misandry. For example, Devon Price says, calling a trans woman a predatory man does not make her one. It certainly does not confer her any social privileges, nor does it make her any less a victim of sexism. It just means that, in addition to sexism, she is experiencing hateful transphobia. This is all true, but he never takes a step back to wonder why being perceived as a man makes a person appear predatory. The answer to that is misandry. It's because men are often assumed to be criminals for no other reason than existing as men. And when a trans woman is perceived as a man, she is often treated like a man. But not just any man, it's a man in a dress. And if a trans woman is viewed as just a man in a dress, then it becomes easier to be violent towards her. Society says, never hit a woman, but that's not a woman, that's a man in a dress, a sexual deviant, a predator, a pervert, a pedophile, a groomer. These are all gendered labels, predominantly used against men. So the reason calling a trans woman a predatory man doesn't confer her any social privileges is because she's not just a man. She is the worst type of man. And that's why it becomes okay to be violent towards her. Because society doesn't consider violence against men to be a serious issue. And it actually considers violence against bad men to be a good thing. So if a trans woman is a predatory man, then that quote-unquote man deserves the violence she receives. So we see how the perception of men play a part in how trans women are treated. Remember what I said at the beginning of this video, that the erasure of misandry exists in the service of TERF rhetoric. It is in essence a conservative ideal. Men are strong, they can never be victimized. One of the main reasons TERFs hate trans women so much is because they hate men. They see trans women as men in disguise, trying to infiltrate women's spaces. TERFs are okay with violence against trans women because they're okay with violence against men. Men deserve it, and if you're a trans woman, you deserve it too, because they think you're a man. And one of the main reasons TERFs can be so sympathetic to trans men is because they view them as women. So hurting them is not okay, because they are not really men. They see trans men as lost sheep, as confused women. J.K. Rowling herself tried to use this fact to prove that TERFs aren't really trans exclusionary because they include trans men, since they consider them women. Of course, there are plenty of TERFs who see trans men as apostates, as women who became men in order to avoid misogyny and become oppressors. And for this reason they absolutely hate trans men, just as much as they hate all other men. Once again, we see how the hatred of men plays a significant role in how TERFs treat trans people. It is such a shame that radical feminist rhetoric has tainted the concept of misandry so much that it is now disallowing trans men to even speak about their own suffering. They sometimes even have to rebrand it as transandrophobia in order to avoid the knee-jerk reaction of instantly being dismissed. That's how normalized the erasure of misandry is. It is my position that the sooner we all acknowledge the misandry that exists at the core of TERF rhetoric, the better we will become at fighting against it. After all, gender-critical feminism is conservative at its core. TERFs talk endlessly about menstruations and getting pregnant. The notion that womanhood is all about birthing babies is a classic conservative belief. The notion that misandry doesn't exist is also conservative, as it stems from the same gender-normative ideals. Devon Price goes on to list a few examples of discrimination against trans men, arguing that if a trans man is discriminated against by being treated as a woman, that's not trans misandry, that's an instance of transference of misogyny from women onto trans men. I partially agree with this, because that's pretty much the argument I used a few moments ago to explain certain aspects of the discrimination trans women receive. In short, when trans women are viewed as men, they inadvertently inherit all the baggage that comes with being treated as a man, including misandry. When trans men are viewed as women, they also inherit all the baggage that comes with being treated as a woman, including misogyny. However, that's not the entirety of discrimination trans people face. It's not always reflected sexism involving their sex assigned at birth. It can also be sexism involving the gender they currently present. A trans woman can be treated as a woman and thus become the victim of misogyny. Likewise, a trans man can be treated as a man and thus become the victim of misandry. Trans people have the burden of being the recipients of sexism from both sides of the gender binary. This creates a unique set of circumstances for trans people, because cis people rarely get to experience something like this, unless they are gender non-conforming or something to that extent. So trans people tend to refer to these experiences as trans misogyny or trans misandry. To claim that one of these groups doesn't have the right to create this theoretical framework to refer to their own experiences is an act of bigotry. Devon Price says that trans men will only stop experiencing sexism when women do. While this is technically accurate, it is a very poorly worded statement. Since, as I explained earlier, trans men receive sexism both as misandry and as misplaced misogyny, for them to stop experiencing sexism altogether is indeed to eliminate misogyny, because they experience both. However, the way this is worded is the same condescending and erasing attitude as the one used against cis men. It's the patriarchy fallacy all over again. It's the notion that men's suffering is of secondary importance, that men only suffer sexism as misogyny by proxy, and that the main goal is always to eliminate sexism towards women. And only once we've done that can we start caring about the suffering of men. Men's suffering is treated as an afterthought. Devon Price goes on to say, "It's not a unique experience for a trans man to be treated as less of a respectable, worthy human being because of this gender minority status. He shares that experience with all trans women, cisgender women, and non-binary people, so there is no need to parcel out his experience and label it as a unique form of oppression, like trans misandry or transandrophobia. To do so is to confuse where trans men's oppression even comes from." This last sentence was what made me decide to make this video. The sheer condescension and paternalism dripping from the text is infuriating. Again, as I explained earlier, misplaced misogyny is not the only form of sexism trans men experience. They also experience misandry, because they are men. They absolutely do need a separate framework to analyze and discuss their experiences, because the trans masculine experience is as unique as the experience of trans women is, but it is not the same. The only person who is confused here is Devon Price, because he fails to realize that one of the sources of trans men's oppression is misandry, the hatred or contempt of their maleness or masculinity, because trans men are not only treated as women, because the oppression of trans men is not manifested only as them being treated as women. It is also manifested as them being treated as men. Then, Devon Price goes on to make all sorts of fallacious arguments. He mentions online harassment, which is intellectually dishonest, because all groups have bad actors who engage in online harassment. So specifically singling out one group comes off as an attempt of vilifying and othering. It's a common silencing tactic, cherry-picking a few instances of bad behavior to discredit an entire position or movement. People did it to feminism, to the suffragette movement, to Black Lives Matter, and many other political movements. It's always a fallacy, no matter who wields it. If you're going to address any form of dissent, you should do it at its strongest form. Otherwise, you are no different from Ben Shapiro dunking on first-year college students. Then Devon Price makes this really weird argument. He says, gay people face different forms of homophobia than lesbians, but it's still homophobia, not androhomophobia. Okay, but the general term of their experiences is still called homophobia. It's not called lesbophobia. It's a neutral term that doesn't favor one side at the expense of the other. In the case of trans people, Devon Price isn't arguing in favor of a neutral label of transphobia, but calling everything misogyny or transmisogyny, even when the victims are men. That's not the same thing at all. Also, if gay people or lesbians wanted to create a new term for the specific type of homophobia they face, they could do that. Who cares? Why should anyone try to gatekeep that? In the next bit, Devon Price seems to believe that any misandry aimed at trans men is because they are suddenly seen as powerful men. He says, but it is not misandry or transmisandry to suddenly be recognized for having power. And while yes, sexism harms men, and men deserve tenderness, patience, and the ability to cry and to be weak, the fact they are denied such things is not due to men being oppressed by misandry. It's just sexism and the gender binary again. When a man is shamed for crying, that is literally misandry. His masculine gender identity is questioned simply because of his behavior. He is shamed for failing to live up to the unattainable expectations of traditional masculinity. That is textbook misandry, not misogyny. If a woman was shamed for failing to live up to the unattainable expectations of traditional femininity, that would be misogyny, not misandry. We can't call both misogyny. It doesn't make any sense. When a man walking alone at night is treated as a criminal, it's not misogyny. It is misandry. The man who walks alone at night has absolutely no power unless he is John Wick. If a woman sees this man and is scared of him, that's literally misandry. She is judging his moral character based on his gender. That's textbook sexism, and since the gender being discriminated upon is masculine, it's misandry. It's really not that complicated. A fallacious counterargument on this is that women are afraid of men due to past experiences, which only further solidifies that this is indeed sexism, because that's the word you would use to describe distrust or resentment towards an entire gender based on the actions of a few. Yet since misandry is so normalized, we consider it reasonable to say things like men are naturally more violent than women, which is gender essentialism. You know why we believe such a thing? Because of misandry. Because maleness is associated with predatory behavior. Men shouldn't be babysitters because they'll rape all the babies. Gay people shouldn't be teachers because they'll rape all the children. Trans women shouldn't go in women's bathrooms because they'll rape all the cis women with their male penises. Wherever there is maleness, there will be assumptions that they are predators. Why? Because of misandry. Men are simply treated as being dangerous, violent, or threatening. There is no logic behind it other than prejudice. And this is reflected by statistical data on the disparities of convictions and sentences between genders, as mentioned earlier. This is the fact of misandry. Devon Price continues trying to deflect misandry as something else by mentioning the Black civil rights movement. When black men are accused of being predators by white women, followed around shops by untrusting store clerks, labeled a behavioral problem by unsympathetic teachers, and viewed by sexual partners as unfeeling brutes, it is not due to a widespread societal hatred of men or of manhood. It is due to the widespread dehumanization of black people, and the terror that white supremacist institutions feel at the prospect that a black person might have any power. Again, this is partially true, but I have a question. How come this happens almost exclusively to black men? Devon Price claims that it was not a hatred of manhood or masculinity that was at play in the injustices against black people. It was a rejection of black humanity and dignity. In part, yes, obviously, but it was also hatred of black manhood. It was the intersection of racism and sexism, and that's why black men and black women often had different experiences. And that's why people like Emmett Till were lynched for the supposed crime of catcalling a white woman. That's why even today, there is a huge phobia of black men coming to fuck white daughters, which is reflected very prominently in mainstream pornography. Speaking of pornography, have you noticed how the black men are almost always extremely muscular with huge penises? It's not just about black people being black, it's about blackness in conjunction with hypermasculinity. When black men are objectified, they are cooler, they are manlier, they are more athletic, more animalistic, dumber, they have enormous dicks. Meanwhile, as a counterexample, Asian men are nerdy, short, unmasculine, smart, pervy, with tiny dicks, and therefore they don't pose the same threat to white daughters. And pop culture reflects this, including porn. It is a huge mistake to remove masculinity from intersectionality, because as we can so easily see, misandry plays a huge role in all of these dynamics, just as important as misogyny. It affects how societies see gay people, straight people, trans people, black people, brown people, white people. It is a significant parameter that should not be ignored. Devon Price simply cherry-picks specific examples that don't relate to masculinity, or if they do, he interprets those examples in a very narrow-minded view so as to exclude the element of masculinity from the equation of inequality. For the rest of the essay, Devon Price simply reiterates that any form of discrimination, exclusion, othering, prejudice, oppression, or suffering a man may face, whether he is cis or trans, it is sad, but it doesn't rise to the level of a systemic problem. Once again, this is factually incorrect, and once again, this is not just a matter of semantics. By establishing this hierarchy and excluding misandry from it, it minimizes both the effect and its importance. You can say men deserve to be taken care of as much as you want, but when you also say misandry doesn't exist and their suffering isn't caused by a systemic problem, you are essentially saying it's not that important. It sucks that this is happening to you, but it's not as important as that other thing that is happening to women, so your suffering shouldn't even have a name. And that's the problem with how deeply ingrained and normalized misandry is. Men don't even deserve to have a word for the thing that causes their suffering. It's not that big a deal because it's just misplaced misogyny. Men's suffering is of secondary importance. It's just a side effect of misogyny, an afterthought. Devon Price's closing remark is that there is no advantage in trans men to attempt to claim a monopoly on their suffering, or to try and parcel it out from the sexism and transphobia experienced by everyone else. This is such an intellectually dishonest statement. Acknowledging the existence of misandry is not a monopoly. On the contrary, Devon Price is the one repeatedly trying to impose a monopoly by arguing that only women can experience real sexism. This fallacy annoys me, because this used to be the argument feminists employed when looking for male allies, that gender equality is not a zero-sum game. That was the slogan. Equality is not a zero-sum game, that we can fight for women's rights without that meaning that men will have less rights. And I agree with this, I fully agree with this. But many times, when men try to speak up and talk about their own suffering in their own spaces and create a framework to discuss their own problems, suddenly they are accused of monopolizing. They are accused of derailing the conversation. They are accused of taking attention away from women's suffering, which is more important. Suddenly, it is a zero-sum game, and men are not only denied a safe space to talk about their problems, but also the tools to do so, by removing words from the vocabulary. Devon Price ends the essay with a call to action. Our fight is together. The burden of overcoming it is shared. I agree with this sentiment, but funny how men are expected to participate in a fight where they don't even have a voice, where their own suffering is not even taken into account. Once again, we see traditionalism masquerading as progressivism. The translation of Devon Price's dishonest call to action is, "You are a man, shut up and go fight. Your problems are not important. Your job is to sacrifice yourself for the good of society." I would like to end this video with a personal note. I myself am not trans, and I won't pretend to know what it's like. As a cis man, I grew up in a very misandrist environment. It was always part of my life, and because of that I am used to it by now. But the notion of suddenly being faced with it is terrifying to me. That a trans man finally has the means to transition, and the moment he does, instead of at long last living the life he always wanted, he gets slapped in the face with systemic and institutional sexism that no one told him existed, And even when he tries to talk about it, people continue to tell him that it doesn't exist. And it's not the people who oppress him that try to gaslight him into thinking that his experiences aren't real. No, it's his friends, his allies. I imagine it would feel like the ultimate betrayal. And I imagine that a lot of trans men feel very lonely and isolated by this. To all those trans men who are told to suffer in silence, I want to say that I hear you and I acknowledge your suffering. Trans misandry is absolutely real, and it's just as real as trans misogyny. Thank you for watching.